The iron wheels of the Union Pacific hammered against the rails, a rhythmic, grinding percussion that had echoed in Lydia Hart's skull for 6 endless days. When the locomotive finally heaved a sigh of white steam and screeched to a halt, the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was heavy, pressing down like the heat of the midday sun. Lydia smoothed the skirts of her traveling dress. It was a sensible wool serge, once a vibrant cornflower blue, now coated in a fine layer of gray soot and red dust that seemed to have permeated every seam of her existence since they crossed the Mississippi River. She checked her reflection in the smudged window glass. At 25 years of age, she felt significantly older than the face staring back at her. Her skin was pale, drawn tight over high cheekbones. Her eyes, usually a sharp hazel, looked washed out by fatigue. She reached up to adjust her hat, securing the pin with a trembling hand, then gripped the handle of her single leather valise. It contained everything she owned in this world: 3 dresses, a silver hairbrush that had belonged to her grandmother, a Bible, and a packet of letters from a man she had never met. "Dusty Mesa Station," the conductor bellowed, his voice cracking with the dryness of the air. "Last stop for the canyon route, Dusty Mesa." Lydia took a breath, holding it in her lungs as if to fortify herself, and stepped down from the metal stairs. Her boot heel struck the wooden platform, and immediately the heat slapped her. It was not the humid, cloying warmth of the East Coast summers she had grown up with. This was a dry, aggressive heat that seemed to suck the moisture right out of her skin. She looked around, expecting to see a bustling town, or at least a carriage waiting with a gentleman in a fine suit. Instead, she saw emptiness. Dusty Mesa was hardly more than a scar on the vast, red landscape of the New Mexico territory. The station itself was a low building of weathered timber, the paint peeling away in long, sunburnt strips. Beyond it lay a scattering of adobe structures and a few wooden storefronts that looked as though a strong wind might blow them over. And beyond that, nothing but miles of sagebrush, sandstone, and a sky so wide and blue it felt indifferent to human suffering. Lydia stood alone on the platform as the porters tossed a few mail sacks onto a cart. There were a few men loitering about, rough-looking cowboys with dust on their chaps and tobacco stains on their beards, but none of them looked like a wealthy ranch owner. She scanned the area again, anxiety beginning to prickle at the base of her neck. In the shadow of the station overhang, leaning against a support beam, stood a man who did not fit in with the railroad workers or the cattle hands. He was tall, standing with a stillness that made him seem like he had grown out of the earth itself. He wore a tunic of soft buckskin that had seen many seasons, and his trousers were tucked into moccasins that reached his calves. His hair was black as a raven's wing, thick and long, braided neatly down his back. He was a Navajo. Lydia had read about the native tribes in the sensationalized penny dreadfuls her stepfather used to hide in his study, but the reality of the man was far more imposing than any illustration. He was not looking at the train. He was looking directly at her. His face was a mask of bronzed composure, strong-jawed and high cheekboned, with eyes that were dark and unreadable. He did not smile. He did not scowl. He simply observed, like a hawk perched on a canyon rim watching a field mouse scurry across the open ground. Lydia quickly averted her gaze, her heart thumping against her ribs. She turned her attention back to the station doors, forcing herself to maintain the posture of a lady. "He will be here," she told herself. "Mr. Malloy is a man of means, a man of honor." He wrote that the carriage would be waiting. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The locomotive took on water, blew its whistle with a mournful shriek, and began to chug slowly away, dragging civilization with it toward the west. Lydia remained on the platform. The silence returned, louder than before. Finally, the station agent, a balding man with sweat stains mapping continents under the arms of his shirt, stepped out. He looked at Lydia, then at her valise, and finally pulled a crumpled piece of yellow paper from his vest pocket. He approached her with the reluctance of a man tasked with shooting a lame horse. "Miss Hart?" he asked, squinting against the glare. "Yes," Lydia said, straightening her spine. "I am Lydia Hart. I am waiting for Mr. Edgar Malloy. Has he sent word that he is delayed? The man sighed and held out the paper. This came over the wire early this morning. Ma'am, I was told to give it to the lady on the noon train. Lydia took the telegram. Her fingers felt numb. She unfolded the paper, the cheap ink smelling faintly of chemicals. Regret to inform. Contract canceled. Do not come to Dusty Mesa. Stop E. Malloy. Lydia read it once. Then she read it again. The words made sense individually, but strung together. They formed a sentence that her mind refused to comprehend. Canceled, she whispered. I'm sorry. Miss, the agent said, tipping his visor but already stepping back toward the safety of his office. Happens sometimes out here. The West changes a man's mind quicker than the weather. But I cannot... Lydia looked up, panic rising in her throat like bile. Sir, you do not understand. I have traveled 2,000 miles. I sold everything I owned for the ticket. I have nowhere to go. The agent looked sympathetic but helpless. Next train east is not for 3 weeks. Ma'am, the schedule is sparse this time of year due to the washouts up north. You best find a room at Dolores's place down the road. It is clean enough. He turned and went back inside, the door shutting with a finality that echoed in the empty air. Lydia stood frozen. The heat waves shimmering off the tracks made the world look fluid, unstable. She had no money. She had $11.40 tucked into her corset cover, barely enough for a few nights of lodging and food, let alone a return ticket to Philadelphia. And even if she went back, what awaited her? Her stepfather's cold disdain, the pitying whispers of the neighbors who knew she had left to become a mail-order bride because she was too old and too poor to find a husband in her own circles. She felt the sting of tears but refused to let them fall. She was a heart. Her father had lost his fortune, but he had never lost his dignity. She would not crumble on a wooden platform in the middle of nowhere. He is not coming back for you. The voice was deep, resonant, and spoke English with a smooth, precise cadence that startled her. Lydia spun around. The Navajo man had moved. He was no longer leaning against the post, but stood only a few yards away. Up close, he was even larger, his broad shoulders blocking out the harsh sun. The scent of sage and old leather clung to him. I beg your pardon, Lydia said, gripping her valise until her knuckles turned white. The station master, the man said, nodding toward the closed door. He thinks you are just another misfortune. He will not help you. Lydia lifted her chin. And I suppose you make it a habit to eavesdrop on private conversations. Sir, I make it a habit to listen to the wind, he replied. His face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, intelligence, sharp and piercing. And when the wind carries the sound of a trap snapping shut, I pay attention. Lydia took a small step back. I do not know who you are, but I assure you I am quite capable of managing my own affairs. Are you? He looked at the telegram still crumpled in her hand. Edgar Malloy is not a man who changes his mind because of a whim. Miss Hart, if he told you not to come, it is because he has already taken what he wanted from the arrangement, or because you are no longer useful to the game he is playing. Lydia stiffened. How do you know Mr. Malloy? Everyone between the Rio Grande and the Colorado River knows Malloy, the man said. He owns the cattle, he owns the water, and he thinks he owns the iron road that brought you here. I am Cain Nez. He said the name without flourish, as if stating a fact as simple as the rock or the sky. Mr. Nez, Lydia said, testing the name. You speak English very well. I was a scout for the army, Cain said. For 5 years, I learned your language so I could understand the orders given to kill my people, and later, so I could understand the treaties that were broken before the ink was dry. The bitterness in his voice was subtle, buried under layers of stoicism. But Lydia heard it. It frightened her. Yet, strangely, it also grounded her. This was a man who dealt in hard realities, not polite fictions. Why are you telling me this? Lydia asked. Why do you care if Mr. Malloy has changed his plans? Cain looked out toward the horizon, where the red mesas rose like fortresses against the sky. I watched you step off the train. You looked at the horizon as if you expected a garden. Malloy brings women here with promises of a garden. But this is the high desert. Things only grow here if they have thorns. He turned his gaze back to her. That telegram. It was not sent from the ranch. The wire line to the ranch has been down for a week since the storm. That message came from Santa Fe, from his lawyers. Lydia looked down at the yellow paper. Lawyers? But why would? Because a marriage contract is a legal bond, Kane said. And Malloy does nothing without a legal reason. If he canceled it now, it means he found a way to get what he wanted without the burden of a wife. A chill ran through Lydia that had nothing to do with the temperature. She remembered the papers she had signed back in Philadelphia, the contracts Malloy's agent had presented to her. There had been clauses about property, about inheritance rights transferred in the event of the union. She had signed them blindly, desperate to escape her stepfather's house. I have been swindled, she whispered, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. I have been brought here, used for a signature, and discarded. It appears so, Kane said. Then I must go to the authorities, Lydia said, clutching her bag. The sheriff. There must be a law. Kane made a sound that might have been a laugh, had it contained any humor. The sheriff in Dusty Mesa eats from Malloy's hand. You go to him, and you will find yourself on a wagon out of town before sunset, dumped in the scrub with nothing but your virtue, and that will not last long against the coyotes or the men. Lydia looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time, he was terrifying. He was a savage in the eyes of everyone she had ever known. But he was standing here, telling her the truth when the white station master had merely offered platitudes and walked away. You are trying to frighten me, she said, though her voice wavered. I am trying to keep you alive. Kane responded. Look around you, Miss Hart. The train is gone. The next one is weeks away. You have no horse, no weapon, and I would wager you have less than $20 in that purse. You are a lamb who has wandered into a den of wolves, and the head wolf has just locked the door. Lydia looked at the vast, empty landscape. The red dust was beginning to swirl around her boots, carried by a rising wind. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the platform. She felt a profound sense of isolation, a loneliness so deep it made her bones ache. What do I do? She asked. The question slipped out before her pride could stop it. Kane shifted his weight. There is a boarding house. Dolores creates a good stew. She is a widow, and she hates Malloy almost as much as I do. You will be safe there for tonight. After that, he shrugged one shoulder. You must decide if you are the kind of woman who breaks, or the kind who fights. And you, Lydia asked. What are you, a scout? A protector. I am just a man who is tired of watching the wolves eat, Kane said. He stepped closer, and for a moment, Lydia thought he might reach out to take her bag, to offer the gentlemanly assistance she had been raised to expect. But he did not. He simply stood there, a towering presence of leather and muscle and ancient sorrow. The boarding house is the blue adobe at the end of the street, he said. Walk in the middle of the road. Keep your hand on your purse. Look at no one. Wait, Lydia said as he turned to leave. Why did you wait? You stood there for an hour. You knew the train was coming, but you knew Malloy would not be here. Why did you wait? Kane paused, his back to her. The wind caught the long fringe of his buckskin shirt. Because I wanted to see who he was going to destroy this time, Kane said softly. And perhaps, I hope that this time, he might have made a mistake. A mistake. Kane looked over his shoulder, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that stripped away her defenses. He thinks you are weak because you are from the East. He thinks you are soft because you wear blue silk and lace. He thinks you will cry, and fade, and die quietly. And what do you think? Lydia asked, her chin trembling slightly. Kane studied her, the set of her jaw, the way she refused to slump despite the exhaustion, the fire that was trying to spark in her hazel eyes. I think the night is coming, Miss Hart, he said, and we shall see if you can hold your light until the morning. With that, he walked away, his moccasined feet making no sound on the wooden planks. He moved with a fluid grace, disappearing into the growing shadows of the alleyway between the general store and the saloon, leaving Lydia alone. The wind picked up, howling across the open scrubland, throwing grit against her face. Lydia Hart stood on the platform of dusty mesa, a speck of blue in a world of rust and blood. The reality of her situation settled upon her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She was alone. She was penniless. She had been betrayed by the man she promised to marry. She looked down at the tracks, the steel lines converging in the distance, leading back to a life that no longer existed for her. Then she looked toward the dusty street where the Navajo warrior had vanished. She tightened her grip on her valise. The leather handle bit into her palm, a grounding sensation. "I will not fade," she whispered to the empty air. "I will not die quietly." She stepped off the platform and onto the dirt road, walking toward the blue adobe house, the dust rising around her skirts, walking straight into the heart of the wild, untamed West. The blue adobe house sat at the end of the dusty street like a bruised fruit in a basket of rocks. Cain Nez pushed the heavy oak door open and gestured for Lydia to enter. The interior smelled of dried sage, chili peppers, and the faint, sweet scent of corn tortillas toasting on a griddle. It was a sharp contrast to the sterile, sun-bleached emptiness of the platform. A woman emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on a stained apron. She was short and round, with a face that looked like it had been carved from mahogany and eyes that held the sharp intelligence of a crow. This was Dolores. "Cain!" She looked from the tall Navajo warrior to the pale, trembling woman in the blue dress. Her expression shifted from suspicion to immediate pity. "Madre de Dios. Another one." "Another one," Cain confirmed, his voice low. He closed the door behind them and slid a heavy wooden bolt into place. "Malloy canceled the contract before she even arrived." Dolores let out a string of Spanish words that Lydia did not understand but instinctively knew were curses directed at the soul of Edgar Malloy. The older woman bustled forward, taking Lydia's valise with surprising strength and guiding her to a rough-hewn table. "Sit, child, sit," Dolores commanded. She poured a cup of dark, thick coffee and shoved it into Lydia's hands. "Drink. It will put iron back in your blood." Lydia took a sip. The liquid was bitter and hot, scalding her tongue, but the warmth spread through her chest, shocking her out of her stupor. She looked up at Cain, who had not sat down. He stood by the window, peering through the crack in the shutters, watching the street. You said there was a game," Lydia said, her voice steadier now. "What game? Why bring me here just to send me away?" Cain turned from the window. "Malloy is not just a rancher. Miss Hart, cows are too slow for his ambition. He is a partner in the Santa Fe Pacific Railroad extension. He wants to lay track through the canyons." "The Red Moon Valley," Dolores added, placing a bowl of stew on the table. "Holy ground for the Navajo. Good grazing land for the Mexicans. Malloy wants it all." Lydia frowned, her mind racing to catch up. "But what does a marriage contract have to do with a railroad?" "Legitimacy," Cain said. He walked over to the table, looming over them. To build the railway through federal land is one thing. To build it through private claims is another. There are old titles on that land. Spanish grants, settlement claims. Lydia reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled telegram. She smoothed it out on the table, reading the words again. "Regret to inform. Contract canceled." "Look at the header," Cain said, pointing a calloused finger at the top of the paper. Lydia squinted. "Sent from Santa Fe, from the offices of Whitmore and Associates?" "Whitmore," Lydia whispered. The name struck a chord in her memory, a dissonant note from her childhood. "My father, before he died, he invested heavily with a man named Whitmore. It was the investment that ruined us. He said he bought shares in the future. He bought land rights," Cain corrected her. "Or rather, the option to claim them. Malloy and Whitmore worked together. They likely discovered that the claim to the key section of the valley belongs to the estate of your father. To you. Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. So he proposed marriage, to merge the assets. Kane finished. Once you were his wife, your property would become his property under territorial law. He would own the right-of-way for his train without spending a single dollar on purchasing the land. But why cancel it? Lydia asked. Perhaps he found a cheaper way, Dolores said darkly. Or perhaps he realized that a wife from the East might ask too many questions once she saw how he treats the people here. The sound of heavy boots crunching on the gravel outside silenced them. Kane signaled for silence with a sharp cut of his hand. He moved silently back to the shadows near the hearth. A fist pounded on the door. "Open up! Dolores, we know you have the girl in there!" Lydia jumped, spilling coffee onto the table. "It is the sheriff," Dolores hissed. "Barnaby. He is Malloy's dog." "Open the door," Kane said softly. "If you do not, they will kick it in." Dolores cursed again, smoothed her apron, and unbolted the door. Sheriff Barnaby was a man who looked like he was made of suet and bad whiskey. He wore a tin star that was tarnished gray, and his hand rested casually on the handle of a pistol holstered at his hip. Two other men stood behind him, looking dusty and mean. Barnaby pushed past Dolores, his watery eyes fixing immediately on Lydia. "Miss Hart," he said, touching the brim of his hat with mock politeness. "Welcome to Dusty Mesa. Shame about the wedding. Truly a shame." Lydia stood up, clutching the back of her chair. "How do you know about that, Sheriff?" "Mr. Malloy is a close friend," Barnaby said with a greasy smile. "He is very concerned about your welfare. He sent me to collect you, and to clear up a little legal mess before you head back east." He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded document. He slapped it onto the table, right over the coffee stain. "Just a formality," Barnaby said, producing a pen and a small ink pot. "Since the marriage is off, we need to annul the prenuptial agreements. Sign here, and we will put you on the next wagon to Santa Fe, Mr. Malloy will even pay for your ticket." Lydia looked at the paper. It was dense with legal jargon. Her hand trembled as she reached for the pen. She just wanted to go home. She wanted this nightmare to end. "Do not sign it." The voice came from the shadows. Barnaby spun around, his hand dropping to his gun. Kane stepped into the light, his hands raised slightly to show he held no weapon, though his stance was coiled and ready. "You," Barnaby spat. "I told you to stay off the street, Nez." "I am not on the street," Kane said calmly. He walked to the table and looked down at the paper. "This is not an annulment of a marriage contract, Sheriff. It is a quitclaim deed." "You can read," Barnaby sneered. "I can read better than you," Kane replied, his eyes cold. He looked at Lydia. "This document states that you transfer all existing and future land claims in the New Mexico Territory to the Whitmore and Malloy Trust for the sum of $1. If you sign this, you give them the valley. You give them everything your father died for." Lydia dropped the pen as if it were a scorpion. "I will not sign." Barnaby's face turned a violent shade of purple. He drew his pistol, leveling it at Kane. "You interference-running redskin! I should have shot you the day you rode back from the reservation." "You can shoot me," Kane said, not flinching. "But there are witnesses. And Miss Hart is a white woman from a respectable family. If she disappears, or if she is coerced, the federal marshals might finally take an interest in your town." "She is a vagrant," Barnaby roared. "And you are disturbing the peace." He grabbed Lydia by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You are coming with me, lady. We will see how stubborn you are after a night in the cell." "Let her go," Kane said. It was not a request. Barnaby laughed, pulling Lydia roughly toward the door. "Or what are you going to fight the law?" Kane moved. He did not draw a weapon. He simply became a blur of motion. He grabbed Barnaby's wrist, twisting it with a sickening crunch. The gun clattered to the floor. In the same motion, Kane shoved the sheriff backward into his two deputies, sending them tumbling into a heap of limbs and curses. "Run!" Kane shouted to Lydia. Lydia did not hesitate. She grabbed her valise and bolted through the open door, her boots skidding on the dirt. Kane was right behind her. "Stop them!" Barnaby screamed from inside the house. A gunshot rang out, splintering the door frame as they sprinted into the twilight. They ran down the alleyways, dodging between rain barrels and piles of lumber. Lydia's breath came in ragged gasps, her corset constricting her lungs, but terror gave her speed. Kane led her away from the main road, circling back toward the edge of town where the train station lay silent and dark. "Why, here," Lydia panted as they crouched behind a stack of railway ties near the water tower. "They will look for us on the road out of town," Kane whispered, scanning the perimeter. "We wait here. The night freight wagon comes through in 3 hours. We can pay the driver to take us as far as the canyon." The sun had fully set now. The temperature plummeted with the speed of a falling stone. The desert night was not just cool. It was aggressively cold. They moved to the far end of the platform, where the shadows were deepest. Lydia sat on the hard wooden bench, shivering violently. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her cold, terrified, and acutely aware of how close she had come to disaster. Kane stood a few feet away, his back to her, watching the town. The wind howled through the telegraph wires, a mournful, singing sound that made Lydia feel small and insignificant. "I am sorry," Lydia said, her teeth chattering. "I have caused you trouble. You could be arrested." "I have been arrested before," Kane said without turning. "For walking on the wrong side of the street. For owning a horse that looked too good. For existing." He turned and looked at her. In the pale light of the rising moon, his face looked older, etched with lines of fatigue that the daylight had hidden. He walked over and sat on the bench, leaving a respectable distance between them, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "You asked me earlier why I waited for you," Kane said quietly. "Yes." "My family lived in the Valley Malloy once," Kane began. His voice took on a rhythmic, storytelling quality, though the story was one of horror. "In 1864, the soldiers came. Kit Carson, they burned our corn. They cut down our peach trees. They killed our sheep." Lydia watched him, mesmerized by the sorrow in his voice. "They forced us to walk," Kane continued. "Hundreds of miles, the long walk, to a place called Bosque Redondo. It was a prison camp, flat and dry. The water made us sick. There was no wood for fires." He looked down at his hands, turning them over as if checking for blood. "I was a boy. I watched my grandmother freeze to death because she gave her blanket to me. I watched my sister taken by soldiers who promised her food." He paused, swallowing hard against the memory. "I learned then that the night is very long when you are alone, and the darkness, it eats you if you do not have something to hold on to." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. Her own loss, her father's bankruptcy, her social fall seemed petty and small compared to the devastation sitting beside her. "I became a scout because I thought if I helped them, if I showed them loyalty, they would let us go home." Kane said bitterly. "They let us go back, eventually. But the home I remembered was gone, and now, men like Malloy want to take even the ashes." He fell silent. The wind whipped around the station, rattling the loose boards. Lydia shivered again, a violent tremor that shook her entire frame. She wrapped her arms around herself, but the thin wool of her dress was useless against the high desert freeze. Kane looked at her. He saw the shaking. He saw the fear in her eyes that mirrored the fear he had felt as a boy on that long, frozen march. He shifted on the bench. He did not move with the predatory grace of a warrior now, but with a hesitant, almost shy caution. "The cold kills out here," he said softly. "I know," Lydia whispered. Kane looked out at the vast, impenetrable darkness of the sagebrush ocean. He seemed to be warring with himself, battling the boundaries of race, of propriety, of his own hardened heart. Finally, he turned to her. His dark eyes were open, unguarded for the first time. "Will you hold me until the night ends?" The question hung in the air between them. It was not a demand. It was not a seduction. It was a plea from one survivor to another. He was asking for warmth. "Yes," But he was also admitting that he could not face the ghosts in the dark alone tonight. Lydia looked at him. She saw the scar above his eyebrow. She saw the pulse beating in his throat. She saw a man who had been hollowed out by history, yet refused to crumble. She was a lady of Philadelphia. Propriety dictated she should stand up and walk away. But propriety had sold her to a tycoon and left her to die on a train platform. Lydia made her choice. She slid across the wooden bench. Yes, she breathed. She reached out and wrapped her arms around his waist. Cain let out a shuddering breath and pulled her in. His arms went around her shoulders, engulfing her. He was solid. He felt like rock and leather and life. Lydia pressed her cheek against the buckskin of his chest. She could hear his heart beating a strong, steady rhythm that countered the chaotic howling of the wind. Thump, 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 thump. It was improper. It was dangerous. If the sheriff found them like this, it would be a scandal that would ruin her name forever. But as Cain's chin came to rest gently on the top of her head, and his body heat began to seep into her frozen limbs, Lydia realized she did not care. For the first time since her father died, she felt safe. They sat there, two outcasts huddled together on a wooden bench at the edge of the world, holding on to each other as the wind screamed and the night stretched out before them, long and dark and full of teeth. "I have you," Cain whispered into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "I have you, Lydia." "And I have you, Cain," she replied. And in the silence that followed, under the vast, uncaring stars, the seed of something fierce and undeniable began to take root in the dry soil of their hearts. The train had left. The world had turned its back, but they were no longer alone. The wagon driver, a man with a beard like a tumbleweed and a silence to match, dropped them off 5 miles past the jagged ridge known as the Devil's Backbone. He took the $3 silver Cain offered, tipped his hat to Lydia without meeting her eyes, and turned his mules back toward the illusion of safety that was the town. Lydia stood in the pre-dawn light, her breath misting in the cold air. The landscape before them was not the flat, boring desert of the maps. It was a chaotic architecture of red sandstone spires, deep crevices, and canyons that looked like wounds cut into the earth. "We walk from here," Cain said, shouldering his pack and checking the cinch on the single horse they had managed to barter for with the last of Lydia's jewelry, a pearl brooch her mother had pinned on her collar before she left Philadelphia. "Walk?" Lydia looked at her boots. They were fine leather, button-up boots meant for walking on cobblestones and parlor rugs, not for traversing a geologic nightmare. "The horse carries the water and the supplies," Cain said, handing her a canteen. "And you, when your feet bleed. But not yet. We need to cover ground before the sun gets high." They moved into the Badlands. The first hour was difficult. The second was agony. The sun rose like a hammer, striking the red rocks and radiating heat that seemed to cook Lydia inside her heavy woolen dress. She stumbled often, catching her hem on sagebrush and cactus spines. By noon, they reached the shadow of a towering cliff face. Lydia collapsed onto a flat rock, her chest heaving. She unbuttoned the top of her collar. Decency be damned. Cain handed her the canteen. "Sip, do not gulp. You will make yourself sick." Lydia took a small mouthful. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most delicious thing she had ever consumed. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of red dust across her pale cheek. "I cannot go much farther," she admitted, her voice raspy. Cain looked at her. He did not offer pity. He reached into his pack and pulled out a heavy knife. He walked over to her and knelt. "Your skirt," he said. "It catches on everything. It is dangerous." Lydia's eyes widened. "Mr. Nez, I hardly think—" "Do you want to be a lady, or do you want to live?" he asked, his eyes locking onto hers. "Malloy's men are trackers. If we are slow, they catch us. If they catch us, they hang me, and they do much worse to you." Lydia swallowed hard. She nodded, with a few swift movements. Cain sliced the heavy hem of her skirt, tearing away the bottom foot of fabric and several layers of petticoats. He handed the scraps to her. Use these to wrap your feet inside your boots. It will stop the blisters. Lydia stared at her ankles. Now exposed to the world, it was scandalous. It was liberating. She did as he said, wrapping the soft cotton around her aching arches. When she stood up, she felt lighter. "Here," Kane said, pulling a heavy revolver from his belt. It looked enormous in his hand. He held it out to her. "Handle first." Lydia recoiled. "I despise guns. My stepfather said they were vulgar." "Your stepfather is in the East," Kane said, pressing the weapon into her palm. "Here, a gun is a tool, like a hammer or a needle. It is heavy." "Yes," Lydia said, the weight of the steel dragging her wrist down. "Good. Respect the weight." He pointed to a dead branch on a mesquite bush 20 yards away. "Aim for the fork in the branch. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it, like you are wringing out a wet cloth." Lydia raised the weapon with 2 hands. She closed one eye, took a breath, and fired. The recoil kicked her arms up violently, and the shot went wild, hitting a rock 10 feet to the left. The sound was deafening. "Again," Kane said calmly. "I missed. Again." She fired until her arms shook and the smell of gunpowder filled her nose. On the 6th shot, the branch splintered. "Good," Kane said, taking the gun back to reload it. "Now you're dangerous." They pushed on. The days blurred into a cycle of heat, dust, and exhaustion. They climbed narrow goat paths where a single slip meant death. They hid in shallow caves when the dust storms rolled in. Brown walls of wind that scoured the skin raw. Lydia Hart, the unwanted stepdaughter, began to shed her former self along with the layers of her clothing. She learned to read the sky for weather. She learned that a certain type of cactus held water if you knew how to cut it. She learned that silence was a language of its own. On the 3rd evening, they camped near a hidden spring, a small pool of water fed by a trickle from the rocks. It was surrounded by cottonwood trees, their leaves turning gold in the autumn air. "The water's cold," Kane said, setting up a small fire. "But it is clean. You should wash. I will keep watch." Lydia looked at the water with longing. She felt coated in a second skin of grime. "Will you turn your back?" "I will watch the canyon entrance," Kane said, turning around and walking 20 paces away. He sat on a rock, his rifle across his knees, facing away from the pool. Lydia stripped off her ruined dress, her corset, and her chemise. The air was cool on her skin. She stepped into the water, gasping as the icy chill hit her. She scrubbed herself with a handful of sand, washing away the sweat and the fear. Kane sat perfectly still, listening to the splash of water. He told himself he was a warrior, a scout, a man of discipline, but the sound of the water, the knowledge of the white woman bathing just yards away, tested his resolve. He heard a splash, louder this time, and instinctively turned his head, his hand tightening on the rifle, checking for a threat. There was no threat. There was only Lydia. She was standing waist-deep in the pool, wringing out her hair. The twilight cast a soft, violet glow over her pale shoulders, the curve of her back, the water beating on her skin like pearls. She turned, sensing his gaze. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Lydia did not scream. She did not cover herself in a panic. She stood there, water dripping from her chin, her hazel eyes meeting his dark ones across the distance. She was vulnerable. Yes, but she stood with a quiet pride he had not seen in the station. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with a sudden, electric heat that defied the temperature of the water. Kane felt a pull in his chest, a hunger that had nothing to do with food. He saw the woman beneath the dress, the fire beneath the manners. Lydia felt her skin flush hot despite the cold spring. She saw the way his eyes darkened, the way his jaw set tight. He was dangerous, beautiful, and he was the only thing standing between her and death. The fear she had felt on the train was gone, replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating awareness of him as a man. Kane forced himself to turn back to the canyon, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. "Finish quickly," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "The sun is gone," Lydia dressed with shaking hands, her heart hammering a rhythm against her ribs that she could not quiet. 2 days later, they reached the entrance to Red Moon Hollow. It was a place that did not exist on any government map. The trail wound through a labyrinth of slot canyons so narrow the sky was just a sliver of blue, before opening up into a hidden valley. It was a shock of green. A creek wound through the center, feeding patches of corn, squash, and beans. Sheep grazed on the slopes. Several hogans, traditional Navajo dwellings made of logs and earth, dotted the landscape, blending into the red earth. Home, Kane breathed, his posture relaxing for the first time in days. They rode down the trail. People emerged from the hogans, women with long skirts and velvet blouses, men with headbands and solemn faces, children who stopped their playing to stare. Lydia felt the weight of their gaze. It was heavy with history and mistrust. To them, she was not Lydia Hart. She was a ghost, a symbol of the encroaching world that had taken everything from them. An old woman stepped forward from the largest hogan. She was small, shrunken by age, but she held herself with the regal bearing of a queen. Her face was a map of wrinkles, her hair pure white, and her eyes were sharp as obsidian glass. She leaned on a staff made of twisted juniper. "Grandmother," Kane said, sliding off the horse and bowing his head. He spoke rapidly in Navajo, his hands moving to emphasize his words. The old woman, Grandmother Nayan, listened without blinking. She looked at Kane, then she looked at Lydia. She walked forward, her moccasins silent on the earth. She stopped in front of Lydia and reached out a hand that looked like a bird's claw. She touched the fabric of Lydia's sleeve, then pointed a finger at Lydia's face. "Bilagana," she said. The word was not a compliment. "She is under my protection," Kane said in English, for Lydia's benefit. "She was abandoned by Malloy. She is an enemy of our enemy." Nayan narrowed her eyes. "An enemy's enemy is not always a friend. She smells of the iron road." "I smell of dust and horse," Lydia said, surprised by her own boldness. "And I am hungry." A flicker of amusement crossed Nayan's face. She gestured to the fire pit. "Then eat. We do not starve guests, even white ones." That night, around the communal fire, the truth came out. Kane laid the map he had drawn on the dirt. He used stones to represent the railway line and the valley. "Malloy needs this pass," Kane explained to the council of elders and warriors. "To go around the mountains costs millions. To go through here costs him nothing. It costs us our graves." A young warrior named Hastian spat. He was handsome, angry, and he had been glaring at Lydia since she arrived. "Why do we let her listen? She will run back to them and tell them how to find us." "She cannot run back," Kane said. "She has nowhere to go." He turned to Lydia. "Tell them about the papers the sheriff tried to make you sign." Lydia took a breath. The firelight danced on the faces of the people around her. He called it a quitclaim deed. "He said my father, Benjamin Hart, had rights to this land." Grandmother Nayan looked up sharply. "Hart, the man who came before the war, the one who traded blankets for silver." "My father was a merchant," Lydia said. "He was a dreamer," Nayan said. "He signed a paper with the chiefs before the long walk. He thought there was gold in the river. There is no gold, only water and spirits. He paid the chiefs in rifles and wagons. The chiefs signed his paper because they did not understand that land could be owned like a horse. But by your white laws, the paper is real." Kane looked at Lydia. "Do you understand now? Your father's investment was this valley. Technically, under United States law. You are not a trespasser here. You are the owner." The silence that followed was absolute. Lydia looked around the circle. She saw fear, anger, and confusion. "I own this." She swept her hand toward the dark outline of the cliffs. "People live here. You have lived here for generations." The law does not care about generations," Kane said bitterly. "It cares about paper. Malloy tried to marry you to get the paper. Now he wants to steal it." Lydia felt a wave of nausea. She was part of the machine. Her very existence, her inheritance, was the weapon being used against these people. She was a civilized woman from the East, raised to believe in property rights and contracts. But sitting here, under the vast canopy of stars, smelling the wood smoke and seeing the fear in the eyes of the children, she realized that civilized was a complicated word. "If I own it," Lydia said slowly, her mind working through the logic, "then I can say who enters. I can say no to the railroad." "You can," Kane said, "but to do that, you must go to the courts. You must stand before a judge in Santa Fe and claim this land, and you must declare that you are keeping it for the Navajo. They will call you a traitor to your race," Nayan said softly. "They will spit on you in the street. You will never be welcome in their parlors again." Lydia looked at the fire. She thought of the tea parties in Philadelphia, the polite conversations about nothing, the suffocating corsets of her old life. Then she looked at Kane. He was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He was not asking her to save them. He was waiting to see who she was. "I have no parlor to go back to," Lydia said. Later that night, the camp settled into sleep. Lydia sat by the dying embers of the fire, unable to rest. Kane came and sat beside her. He began sharpening his knife, the rhythmic shh sound soothing in the quiet. "You spoke well tonight," Kane said. "I spoke words." Lydia replied, "I do not know if I have the courage to back them up." "Courage is not having no fear," Kane said. "It is being terrified and saddling the horse anyway." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of turquoise, polished smooth. He handed it to her. "What is this?" "It is a piece of the sky that fell to earth," Kane said. "It protects the traveler." Lydia closed her fingers around the cool stone. Their hands brushed, and this time, neither pulled away. Kane's fingers were rough, scarred, and warm. He traced the line of her wrist, his touch gentle, questioning. Hastian, the young warrior, walked past them on his way to the perimeter. He stopped, his eyes flicking from Kane's hand to Lydia's face. He said something in Navajo, a sharp, biting phrase, and walked on. Kane stiffened, but he did not move his hand. "What did he say?" Lydia asked. "He said that a wolf who sleeps with a sheep will eventually taste blood." Kane translated, his voice flat. "And will you?" Lydia asked, turning her hand so her palm met his, interlacing their fingers. "Taste blood." Kane looked at her, his eyes dark with a mixture of desire and sorrow. "I have tasted enough blood for 10 lifetimes. Lydia, now, I only want to taste peace. But peace is a luxury we cannot afford yet." He squeezed her hand once, hard, then stood up. "Sleep. Tomorrow we work. You must learn to ride like a warrior, not a passenger." The peace of the valley did not last long. 2 days later, a scout rode in, his horse foaming at the mouth. He galloped straight to Nayan's hogan, shouting news that brought the entire camp running. Kane listened, his face turning to stone. He turned to Lydia, who was standing by the creek washing clothes with the other women. "It has begun," Kane said, his voice carrying the weight of a thunderhead. "What?" Lydia asked, wiping her soapy hands on her apron. "Malloy has signed a preliminary agreement with the territorial governor," Kane said. "He has been granted a right-of-way pending a survey. He is bringing a survey team here. They are escorted by 20 hired guns and a detachment of cavalry." "Soldiers?" Lydia asked. "Yes, Captain Holloway. I know him. He is a man who follows orders." "When will they be here?" 3 days, Kane said, looking up at the red cliffs that formed the walls of their sanctuary. "Malloy has given the order to clear the area. He does not know you are here. He thinks he is just evicting squatters." Lydia felt the turquoise stone in her pocket. The safe haven of Red Moon Hollow suddenly felt very fragile. "What do we do?" she asked. Kane looked at her, then at the women and children gathering behind them. He checked the load in his revolver. "We stop running," Kane said. "We make the night end on our terms." The wind picked up, swirling the red dust around them, carrying the scent of rain and the metallic tang of coming violence. The stakes had been raised. It was no longer just about a marriage or a contract. It was about survival. And Lydia Hart, the abandoned bride, realized with a jolt of terrified clarity that she was no longer an observer. She was standing in the middle of the war. The plan was born of desperation and sculpted by the sharp mind of Dr. Elias Ward. He was a man whose medical bag contained as much whiskey as it did laudanum, and whose cynicism was only outweighed by his hidden hatred for the men who ruled Dusty Mesa. "You must play the part, my dear," Dr. Ward had told Lydia back in the safety of the hollow. "Malloy expects a broken woman. Give him one." And so, they returned to Dusty Mesa not as warriors, but as a tragedy. The town was preparing for a celebration. Bunting hung from the balconies of the Golden Steer Saloon. The air smelled of roasted meat and cheap gunpowder. Edgar Malloy had invited the territorial power brokers to announce the imminent expansion of the railway. It was a coronation, and he was the king. Lydia walked down the main street. Her head bowed. She wore the blue traveling dress, but they had rubbed dust into the seams and torn the lace at the cuffs. She looked like a woman who had spent a week weeping in the desert. 2 paces behind her walked Kane. He was no longer the proud scout in buckskin. He wore rough, stained workman's clothes, a hat pulled low over his eyes, and he carried Lydia's valise with a slump in his shoulders that suggested total submission. It was a disguise that made Lydia's heart ache with anger. To survive, he had to diminish himself. The townsfolk watched them pass. "Look!" a woman whispered loud enough to be heard. "That is the Hart girl. Came crawling back, did she? And with a savage towing her bag." A man spat, chewing on a matchstick. "Shameful." Lydia kept her eyes on the ground, but her hands were fists inside the folds of her skirt. "Let them talk," she thought. "Let them see the victim. They will never see the thief." They reached the steps of the Golden Steer. Inside, the piano was hammering out a lively tune, and the laughter was raucous. "Wait here," Lydia ordered Kane loudly, her voice trembling with feigned nervousness. "Do not speak to anyone." Kane touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of servitude that hid the lethal calculation in his eyes. "Yes, miss." Lydia pushed through the swinging doors. The saloon went quiet for a heartbeat. Then the noise resumed. Though heads turned, at the center of the room, holding a glass of champagne, stood Edgar Malloy. He looked prosperous, his waistcoat straining against his midsection, his face flushed with triumph and liquor. He saw her. A slow, oily smile spread across his face. "Well, well," Malloy boomed, parting the crowd. "The prodigal bride returns." Lydia forced a tear to slip down her cheek. "Mr. Malloy, I had nowhere else to go. The station master said you were here." Malloy laughed, a sound that grated like gravel. "I told you to go home, Lydia, but I suppose a woman without means has few choices." He stepped closer, smelling of cigar smoke and bay rum. "You have come to beg for your ticket back east, I assume." "I have come to apologize," Lydia said, her voice barely a whisper. "I was confused. I acted rashly. Please, sir," the crowd murmured. Malloy preened. He loved nothing more than submission. "I am a benevolent man," Malloy announced to the room. "The lady admits her fault. Let us not be cruel." He gestured to the band. "Play a waltz. Tonight we celebrate the future, and even the lost sheep are welcome." The music started, a slow, lilting melody. Malloy extended a hand. "Dance with me, Lydia. Show these good people that there are no hard feelings." Lydia took his hand. It was damp and fleshy. She let him pull her onto the floor. Outside, by the window, Kane watched. He stood in the shadows, his body rigid, seeing Malloy's hand on Lydia's waist, seeing the way the man pulled her too close, made a rage burn in Kane's gut that was hotter than any branding iron. He wanted to shatter the glass, storm the floor, and tear Malloy apart with his bare hands. But he forced himself to breathe. The mission, he reminded himself. She is the distraction. You are the shadow. Inside, the dance was a torment. Malloy held Lydia tight, his fingers digging into her ribs. "You are smarter than you look," Malloy whispered in her ear, his breath hot on her neck. "Coming back here, begging." "I am just tired. Edgar," Lydia said, using his first name to feign intimacy. She stumbled slightly, pressing her chest against his vest. "Careful now," Malloy chuckled, "or people will think you are trying to seduce me back into that contract." He lowered his voice, the tone dropping to something predatory. "Though perhaps we do not need a contract for an arrangement. You are a handsome woman, Lydia. If you are obedient, I could find a place for you. Not as a wife, of course. But a man has needs in the city." Lydia felt bile rise in her throat. She wanted to scream. Instead, she let out a shaky sigh and leaned her head on his shoulder, masking her movements. "You are very generous," she murmured. Her right hand drifted down between them. She felt the heavy gold watch chain on his vest. She followed it to the pocket. Her fingers, nimble from days of loading cartridges and tying knots, slipped inside. She felt the cold metal of a ring of keys. Malloy spun her around. Lydia used the momentum to slide the keys out of his pocket and into the sleeve of her own dress. "I feel faint," Lydia said suddenly, pulling away. "The heat. Please, I must sit." "Of course," Malloy said, patting her arm patronizingly. "Go to the back room. Compose yourself. I have business to attend to." Lydia curtsied, her knees shaking not from weakness, but from adrenaline. She turned and hurried toward the hallway that led to the private offices. Clutching her wrist where the cold iron keys burned against her skin, she met Kane by the back door. He was already there, having slipped through the kitchen. His eyes were dark, scanning her face for damage. "Did he touch you?" Kane asked, his voice a low growl. "He touched my waist," Lydia said, producing the keys. "But I took his kingdom." They moved quickly. The hallway was empty. Lydia tried 3 keys before the heavy oak door to the records room clicked open. They slipped inside, and Kane locked it behind them. The room was small, lined floor to ceiling with filing cabinets and shelves bursting with ledgers. It smelled of stale tobacco and dust. A single window looked out onto the alleyway. "Hurry," Kane said. "Dr. Ward has the horses waiting 2 streets over." Outside, the weather turned. The heat of the day collapsed under a sudden pressure front. Thunder rumbled, low and menacing, shaking the window pane. Lydia began pulling files. "Land claims. Malloy. Whitmore." "Here," Kane said, pulling a thick ledger from a lower shelf. "Railroad surveys. 1879. They worked in feverish silence. The wind began to howl, slamming against the building. Rain started to fall. Heavy drops that sounded like bullets hitting the roof. "Found it," Lydia gasped. She pulled a folder from the stack. "The deed transfer. Look." She held the paper up to the dim light of the kerosene lamp. It was a document transferring the Hart claim to the Malloy Trust. At the bottom was a signature, Lydia Hart. "I never signed this," she said, anger trembling in her voice. "The date is from 2 weeks ago. I was still in Pennsylvania." "Keep looking," Kane said, his eyes on the door. "We need the order for the raids." Lydia dug deeper. She found a bundle of letters tied with twine. She opened one. "To Captain Holloway. The savages in Red Moon Hollow are becoming a threat to the survey teams. We need a show of force. Ensure the reports reflect unprovoked aggression on their part. E. Malloy." "This is it," Lydia said. "Proof he is orchestrating the war." Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated the room, blindingly white, followed instantly by a crack of thunder that sounded like the world splitting open. The lights in the room flickered and died. In the sudden darkness, Lydia gasped and backed up, bumping straight into Kane. He caught her by the arms to steady her. They were pressed together in the cramped aisle between the shelves. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and the musk of old paper. Lydia could feel the heat radiating from him, the tension in his muscles. "We have what we came for," Kane whispered. Lydia looked up. Another flash of lightning lit his face. He was looking at her not as a protector, but with a raw, unguarded hunger that mirrored the storm outside. The jealousy from the ballroom, the fear of the mission, the weeks of denied attraction, it all boiled over. "Kane," she breathed. He did not ask this time. He lowered his head and captured her mouth. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of danger and rain. Lydia dropped the file folder, her hands tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer. Kane's arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her slightly, crushing her against the wall of files. It was a release of everything they had held back: the anger at the world, the fear of death, the overwhelming need to be alive in this moment. For a long minute, there was no Malloy, no railroad, no difference in their skin. There was only the frantic meeting of breath and lips. Kane broke the kiss, his forehead resting against hers, his breathing ragged. "If we do not leave now," he rasped, "I will not be able to stop." Lydia's lips were swollen, her heart hammering against his chest. "Then let us leave, but do not let me go." "Never," Kane promised. He grabbed the documents and stuffed them into his shirt. "The window. It is the only way." They scrambled out the window into the driving rain. The alley was a river of mud. They ran toward the spot where Dr. Ward was waiting, but Malloy was not a fool. As they rounded the corner, a shout rang out. "There, stop them!" 3 men stepped out from under the awning of the livery stable, rifles raised. They were Malloy's hired guns. "Down!" Kane shouted, shoving Lydia behind a water trough. The night erupted in gunfire. Bullets chipped splinters off the wooden trough. Kane returned fire, his revolver flashing in the dark. "Stay low," he commanded. Lydia did not stay low. She pulled the heavy Colt revolver from her skirts, the one he had taught her to use. She rested the barrel on the edge of the trough, took a breath, and aimed at the muzzle flash in the darkness. She squeezed the trigger. A man yelled out in pain and dropped his rifle. Kane looked at her, shock and pride warring on his face. "Good shot." "I aimed for the fork in the branch," Lydia shouted over the rain. They provided covering fire for each other, moving backward toward the horses. Dr. Ward was there, holding the reins of 3 skittish mounts. "Mount up," Ward yelled. "I have a diversion ready." As they swung into the saddles, a massive explosion rocked the other end of town. The doctor had set a black powder charge in the empty shed behind the sheriff's office. In the confusion, they galloped out of Dusty Mesa, the rain swallowing their tracks, but they were not unscathed. As they rode into the darkness of the open range, Kane slumped forward in his saddle. "Kane!" Lydia screamed, spurring her horse alongside his. "Keep riding," Kane gritted out. "It is just a scratch." It was not just a scratch. By the time they lost their pursuers in the labyrinth of the canyons, Kane was swaying dangerously. The storm had turned the temperature to freezing. "We cannot make it to the hollow tonight," Dr. Ward shouted over the wind. "He is losing blood." "There is a shepherd's cabin 2 miles east. We have to stop." The cabin was little more than a pile of rocks with a roof, abandoned and smelling of damp earth. They carried Kane inside. Dr. Ward lit a lantern. "Shoulder," the doctor said, cutting away Kane's soaked shirt. "Bullet passed through the fleshy part. Missed the bone, thank God, but he has lost blood, and the cold is setting in." The doctor cleaned the wound quickly and stitched it up while Kane bit down on a piece of leather, his body slick with sweat despite the freezing air. "I need to take the horses and lead the trail away from here in case they are tracking us," Ward said, standing up. "Lydia, you stay. Keep him warm. If his temperature drops too low, shock will kill him." "I will," Lydia said. The doctor left, sealing the door against the wind. Lydia was alone with Kane. The cabin was freezing. There was a single narrow cot in the corner with a moth-eaten wool blanket. "Lydia," Kane whispered, his teeth chattering. "Hush," she said. She stripped off her soaked dress and petticoats until she was in her chemise. Then she turned to him. "We need to get these wet clothes off you." She struggled to remove his boots and pants, leaving him in his undergarments. He was shivering violently, his skin cold to the touch. Lydia helped him onto the cot and pulled the blanket over them. It was not enough. The cold seeped through the floorboards. She knew what she had to do. It was a survival technique Kane had told her about weeks ago. Shared heat. Lydia lay down beside him on the narrow mattress. She pressed her body along the length of his, wrapping her arms around him, tangling her legs with his. "Lydia," Kane groaned, trying to pull away. "You cannot. This is not right. I am—" "You are freezing," she said firmly, pulling him tighter. And I am not letting you die." They lay there in the dark, skin against skin. Slowly, the heat from her body began to transfer to him. The shivering subsided into occasional tremors. The intimacy was overwhelming. Lydia could feel every scar on his back, the hardness of his muscles, the heavy rhythm of his breathing. Her hand rested on his chest, over his heart. "You should not be here," Cain whispered into the darkness. "A woman like you, in a place like this, with a man like me." "A man like you?" Lydia asked softly. "You mean a brave man, an honorable man?" "A savage," Cain said, the word heavy with self-loathing. "That is what they see. If they find us like this, you will be ruined. You will be an outcast forever." Lydia lifted her head, propping herself up on one elbow to look at him in the dim light. She traced the line of his jaw with her thumb. "Do you think I care about their tea parties and their hypocrisy?" she asked. "I spent my whole life trying to be the perfect daughter, the perfect prospect for a husband. And it got me sold like cattle. Lydia." "No, listen to me," she said fiercely. "Tonight, in that office, I was not afraid of the gunfight. I was afraid that I would die without ever telling you." "Telling me what? That I would rather be an outcast with you than a queen in their world?" She leaned down, her lips brushing his ear. "I do not want a white husband, Cain. I want the man who stood in the rain and waited for me when no one else would." Cain let out a sound that was half sob, half growl. He turned his head, capturing her lips again. This time, the kiss was slow, reverent, and full of a longing that burned hotter than the fever. His hand moved to her waist, pulling her flush against him. The boundary between nurse and lover dissolved. There was no explicit act that followed, only the profound, silent weaving of two souls in the dark. They held each other as if they were the only two people left on earth, their bodies a shield against the cold and the hate that waited outside. The scene faded with the image of them entangled under the rough wool blanket. Lydia's head on Cain's chest, his hand protective over her. The storm raging outside, but unable to touch the fire they had kindled within. Morning brought a pale, gray light. The storm had broken. They rode back to Red Moon Hollow in silence, the weight of the night's intimacy hanging between them like a sacred promise. Cain's wound was stiff, but he sat tall in the saddle. When they arrived, the mood in the valley was grim. Grandmother Nayan met them at the entrance. She looked at the bandages on Cain, then at the fierce set of Lydia's jaw. She nodded, understanding what had passed between them. But she held up her hand. "There is no time to rest," Nayan said. "A rider came from the south. What is it?" Cain asked, sliding off his horse with a wince. "Malloy did not just send gunmen," Nayan said gravely. "He has convinced the colonel in Santa Fe that we are in rebellion. He has invoked the Insurrection Act." Cain went still. Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. "What does that mean?" Lydia asked. "It means," Cain said, looking at her with eyes that were suddenly very old, "that Captain Holloway is not coming to arrest us. He is coming to war, and he is bringing a cannon." Lydia reached into her pocket and gripped the turquoise stone. The documents they had stolen were powerful, but paper burns, and an army was coming to turn Red Moon Hollow into a graveyard. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon in mid-afternoon, a suffocating brown stain against the pristine blue of the New Mexico sky. It moved with the slow, inexorable weight of a glacier, churning toward the hidden entrance of Red Moon Hollow. Cain stood on the ridge, his spyglass pressed to his eye. Beside him, Lydia shielded her eyes from the glare. She wore a pair of men's trousers under her tattered blue dress, the hem of which was now stained with mud and dried blood from the night before. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady. 40, Cain said, collapsing the brass telescope with a sharp click. 20 hired guns, 10 teamsters driving supply wagons, and a detachment of the United States Cavalry, 10 men, led by Captain Holloway. "He brought the army," Lydia whispered. The reality of it settled in her stomach like a stone. "He convinced them we are a threat. He told them we are insurgents," Cain corrected. That gives them the legal right to shoot on sight. They rode back down to the valley floor where the people of Red Moon Hollow were waiting. The fear was palpable. Mothers clutched their children. Old men checked the firing mechanisms of antiquated rifles. Grandmother Nyan stood in the center of the circle. She looked at Kane, then at Lydia. "We must decide," Kane announced, his voice carrying over the sound of the wind. "The canyon behind the waterfall leads deeper into the mountains. It is a hard path. We would leave the sheep, the crops, the Hogans. We would survive, but we would be ghosts again, running in the dark." Or Hastian, the young warrior, stepped forward. He held a Winchester rifle, his knuckles white on the wood. "Or we stand," Lydia said. She stepped into the circle, and this time, no one looked away. "We have the papers. We have proof that Malloy is a criminal and that this land belongs to me, and through me, to you, but paper is useless if we are dead before we can show it to someone who cares." "Captain Holloway is a rigid man," Kane said, "but he is a man of honor. If he sees the truth, he will stop. But Malloy knows this. Malloy will try to kill us before the captain gets close enough to listen." A murmur went through the crowd. It was a gamble. To stand meant to risk massacre. To run meant to lose their home forever. Nyan struck the ground with her staff. "I am too old to walk another long walk," she declared. "My bones belong to this earth. If they want them, they must dig for them here." The decision was made. They spent the remaining hours of daylight turning the peaceful valley into a fortress. "The children and the elders go to the caves," Kane ordered. "Dolores, take the women who cannot shoot and get them underground. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." Lydia worked alongside the men, hauling rocks to create breastworks near the narrow entrance of the canyon. Dr. Elias Ward was setting up a field hospital behind a large boulder, laying out his instruments with grim precision. "You should be with the women, Lydia," Dr. Ward said, wiping his spectacles. "I am the owner of this property." "Doctor," Lydia replied, checking the load in her heavy Colt revolver. "And I am the only one who can talk to the captain without being shot on sight. My place is at the front." As the sun began to set, the atmosphere shifted. The wind died down, and a strange, heavy silence fell over the Badlands. The moon rose, but it was not the pale silver disk of usual nights. It was swollen and tinged with a deep, bloody copper color, the result of the massive dust cloud kicked up by Malloy's approaching army, filtering the light. "A blood moon," Hastian whispered, making a sign of protection over his chest. "It is just dust," Kane said. Though his hand rested on his knife, he moved to Lydia's side. "Stay behind the ridgeline until I signal. Malloy will send his own men in first. He will want to spark the chaos." At 10 o'clock at night, the attack began. It started not with a shout, but with fire. Flaming arrows, a crude imitation of Indian tactics meant to confuse the narrative, arced over the canyon walls, landing on the dry thatch of the outer hogans. Fire. Someone screamed, as the structures burst into flames, casting long, dancing shadows against the canyon walls. The gunfire erupted. Malloy's mercenaries rushed the entrance, firing wildly. They were met by the disciplined, rhythmic fire of Kane and his warriors. "Hold the line," Kane shouted, firing his rifle, working the lever with a speed that blurred in the firelight. "Do not let them break the choke point." Lydia crouched behind a sandstone slab, the heat of the burning hogans warming her back. She saw a man in a duster coat scrambling up the rocks toward their flank. She raised her revolver, took a breath, and fired. The man yelled and tumbled backward. She did not feel triumph, only a cold, necessary resolve. But Malloy had numbers, and he had no morals. "Dynamite," Dr. Ward yelled. A stick of dynamite landed near the barricade. The explosion was deafening, sending a shower of rock and dirt into the air. Through the smoke, the mercenaries surged forward. "Fall back," Kane commanded. "To the second line." They retreated deeper into the valley. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic smell of blood. Lydia saw Hastian go down, clutching his leg. Still firing, Two other warriors dragged him to cover. From the chaos, a new sound emerged, the bugle of the cavalry. "That is Holloway," Kane said, wiping soot from his face. "He is coming through the breach." "I have to get to him," Lydia said. She grabbed the leather satchel containing the stolen documents. "It is suicide." Kane grabbed her arm. "The crossfire will cut you down. If I do not go, we all die," Lydia shouted over the roar of a collapsing roof. "Cover me." Before Kane could stop her, Lydia ran. She did not run away from the fight. She ran toward the burning center of the village, where the main force was breaking through. She spotted a riderless horse, a paint mare belonging to one of the fallen scouts. She swung into the saddle, gripping the mane, and kicked the horse into a gallop. She rode like a demon, her hair flying loose from its pins, her torn blue dress billowing like a war banner. She cut through the smoke, heading straight for the line of blue-coated soldiers forming up near the creek. "Holloway!" she screamed. "Captain Holloway!" A mercenary saw her. "Get the girl," Malloy said. "No witnesses." 3 riders broke off from the main group to intercept her. Lydia fired her revolver to the left, forcing one rider to veer off, but the other 2 were closing in. Suddenly, a dark shape launched itself from a rock outcropping above. Kane. He leaped onto the back of the nearest rider, tackling him out of the saddle. They hit the ground in a tangle of limbs and knives. Lydia did not look back. She pushed the mare harder. She was 50 yards from the captain when a shot rang out, louder than the rest. Her horse squealed and collapsed, throwing Lydia forward. She hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of her. She scrambled to her knees, gasping, clutching the satchel. A shadow fell over her. Edgar Malloy stood there. He looked demonic in the flickering firelight, his fine suit covered in dust, his face twisted in a rictus of rage. "You persistent little witch!" Malloy snarled. He grabbed her by the hair, dragging her up. Lydia screamed and clawed at his face, but he was heavy and fueled by fury. He jammed the cold barrel of a pistol against her temple. "Drop it," Malloy roared to the valley at large. "Stop firing, or I will blow her brains out." The battlefield froze. The sight of a white woman being held hostage by the man who was supposed to be her savior was enough to pause even the soldiers. Kane emerged from the smoke. 10 yards away, he had a knife in one hand and a revolver in the other. He froze when he saw the gun at Lydia's head. "Let her go, Malloy," Kane said, his voice deadly calm. "You stay back, savage," Malloy shouted, tightening his grip on Lydia. He dragged her backward toward the cliff edge that dropped off into the creek below. "You see this, Captain?" he yelled at the officer who was now riding forward cautiously. "These animals kidnapped her. They are using her as a shield. I am rescuing her." Captain James Holloway, a man with a handlebar mustache and eyes that had seen too much war, raised his hand to halt his troops. "Mr. Malloy, the lady does not look like she is being rescued." "She is hysterical," Malloy spat. "Stockholm Syndrome. Now order your men to fire. Captain, wipe them out." Lydia felt the cold steel against her skin. She saw Kane's eyes, desperate, calculating, terrifyingly helpless. She realized Malloy was going to kill her the moment the soldiers started shooting. She was at a loose end. She had one chance. "He is lying," Lydia screamed, her voice cracking. "Captain, he is lying." She ripped the satchel open with a violent twist of her body, ignoring the pain of her hair being yanked. She flung the contents onto the ground between them and the captain. The wind caught the papers, letters, deeds, the forged contract. They scattered like white leaves on the red earth. "Read them," Lydia shrieked. "The order to stage the raids, the forgery of my father's deed. He hired the men who burned your supply wagons last month to blame the Navajo. He is playing you for a fool, Captain." Holloway looked down. One of the papers had landed near his horse's hooves. He leaned down, still in the saddle, and snatched it up. "Do not listen to her," Malloy yelled, panic edging into his voice. "She is mad." Holloway read the paper. It was the letter to the mercenary leader, explicitly detailing the plan to burn a cavalry wagon to incite the army's involvement. It was signed by Edgar Malloy. The captain looked up. His face was hard as granite. "Sergeant," Holloway said calmly. Lower your weapons. What? Malloy screamed. I pay your salary. You incompetent. You pay my taxes, sir. Holloway cut him off. You do not pay for my honor. He turned his revolver not on the Navajo, but on Malloy. Release the woman. Mr. Malloy, you are under arrest for treason and conspiracy to incite insurrection. The silence that followed was louder than the battle. The wind howled through the canyon. Malloy looked at the soldiers. He looked at Kane. He looked at the ruin of his plan. His face contorted into a mask of pure, nihilistic hate. If I cannot have the land, Malloy whispered into Lydia's ear, I will take the air. His finger tightened on the trigger. Lydia squeezed her eyes shut. Bang! The shot was instantaneous, but Lydia did not feel the bullet. Instead, Malloy screamed a high, wet sound. The gun in his hand went flying, spinning into the darkness, accompanied by a spray of red mist. Lydia fell to her knees as Malloy staggered back, clutching the ruin of his right hand. 10 yards away, Kane stood with his revolver raised, smoke drifting lazily from the barrel. It was a shot of impossible precision, made in the flicker of firelight, aimed not to kill, but to disarm. My hand! Malloy shrieked, falling to the dirt. My hand! Kane walked forward. He did not look at the soldiers. He did not look at the screaming tycoon. He walked straight to Lydia. He dropped his gun and fell to his knees in the dirt beside her. He grabbed her face in his hands, checking her for wounds, his touch frantic. Lydia, he choked out. Lydia, I am alive, she whispered, her hands gripping his wrists. She was shaking so hard her teeth rattled. I am alive. Captain Holloway dismounted. He signaled to his men. Secure the prisoner, and get a medic for him, though I am not in a hurry. The soldiers moved in, dragging the sobbing Malloy away. The mercenaries, seeing their paymaster fallen and the U.S. cavalry turned against them, threw down their weapons and raised their hands. The Battle of Red Moon Hollow was over, but victory was not a cheer. It was a sob. Dawn broke over the valley, revealing the cost. 3 hogans were piles of smoldering ash. The bodies of 4 Navajo warriors lay covered in blankets near the creek. One of them was Hastian, the young man who had doubted Lydia. He had died holding the line at the second barricade. Dr. Ward moved among the wounded, his white shirt stained red. Dolores was weeping silently as she bandaged a child's arm. Lydia sat on a flat rock near the edge of the camp. She was exhausted beyond the point of feeling. Her face was streaked with soot and dried tears. Her dress was ruined. Kane came to her. He had washed the blood from his hands, but the stain of the night was in his eyes. He sat down beside her, not touching her, just sharing the space. They watched the soldiers loading Malloy onto a wagon. They watched the sun hit the top of the red cliffs, turning them a brilliant, indifferent gold. We won, Lydia said, her voice hollow. Did we? Kane looked at the covered bodies. The land is safe, but Hastian will never see the corn grow again. The children will remember the smell of burning for the rest of their lives. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his head bowing. The adrenaline had faded, leaving only the crushing weight of leadership and loss. I asked you once to hold me until the night ends, Kane said softly. Lydia looked at him. She saw the cracks in his armor. She saw the man who carried the grief of a nation on his shoulders. She reached out and pulled him into her arms. It was not a romantic embrace. It was desperate. It was fierce. She buried her face in his neck, smelling the smoke and the sweat and the life of him. The night is over, Kane, she whispered. The sun is up. This night, Kane murmured, his arms tightening around her until it almost hurt. But there will be other nights. They will always want what we have. Lydia, the paper protects us today. But what about tomorrow? Then we fight tomorrow, Lydia said, pulling back to look him in the eyes. But we do it together. Together, Kane repeated. He reached up and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a smear of ash. You look terrible. Lydia let out a small, watery laugh. I imagine I do. I believe I have violated every rule of etiquette in the Philadelphia Handbook. "You are beautiful," Kane said. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact, as true as the rock in the sky. "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen in this broken world." They sat there as the camp began to stir with the business of the living. They held on to each other, two survivors in a landscape of dust and blood, knowing that their love had been forged in fire, and that while the battle was won, the war for their future had only just begun. The night had been long, longer than any they had known, but they had kept their promise. They had held on. The silence that fell over Red Moon Hollow in the weeks following the battle was not the heavy, terrified silence of the siege. It was a busy, bureaucratic silence, broken by the scratching of fountain pens and the rustling of legal paper. The Federal Commission arrived 19 days after the shooting stopped. They came in a convoy of black carriages that looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of the red sandstone cliffs. They were men in wool suits who sweated profusely and looked at the Navajo with a mixture of anthropological curiosity and deep-seated unease. Leading them was Commissioner Thaddeus Sterling, a man whose job was to ensure that the expansion of the United States did not look quite so bloody in the newspapers back east. Captain James Holloway had been true to his word. His report had been scathing. He had detailed the forgery, the false flag attacks on his own supply wagons, and the attempted murder of a woman who held legal title to the land. The evidence Lydia and Kane had stolen from the safe was spread out on a table in the center of the valley, weighed down by rocks to keep the wind from carrying it away. "It is quite comprehensive," Commissioner Sterling admitted, adjusting his spectacles as he looked at the letter signed by Edgar Malloy ordering the burning of the cavalry wagons. "And quite damning." Dr. Elias Ward stood by the table, his arm in a sling from a graze he had taken during the fight. "It is not just damning, Commissioner. It is a hanging offense. Malloy orchestrated a war for profit." Dolores stepped forward, her hands folded over her apron. She spoke in Spanish, which Lydia translated. "He burned my neighbor's barn to blame the Apache. He threatened to kill my son if I sold supplies to the reservation. He is a monster." The weight of the testimony was crushing. Malloy, who had been held under guard in a makeshift tent prison, was brought out. He was a shadow of the man who had held court in the Golden Steer Saloon. His hand was bandaged heavily, the result of Kane's precise shot, and his expensive suit was ruined, but his eyes still held a glint of arrogant defiance. "This is a farce," Malloy spat as the marshals shackled his ankles. "I was bringing civilization to this wasteland. Washington will understand that. Washington understands that you tried to use the United States Army as your personal hit squad," Commissioner Sterling said coldly. "You are going to Santa Fe, Mr. Malloy. And then, I suspect, you will be going to a federal penitentiary for a very long time." As the wagon carried Malloy away, bouncing over the rutted trail, a cheer did not go up from the Navajo. They watched him go with solemn eyes. They knew that for every Malloy they removed, another would eventually take his place. But for now, the snake had been beheaded. With the villain removed, the real work began. The negotiation. Lydia Hart sat across from Commissioner Sterling in the largest hogan. Kane stood behind her, a silent sentinel in the shadows. "The government is prepared to make a concession," Sterling said, wiping his forehead with a linen handkerchief. "Given the validity of your father's original claim and the unfortunate nature of Mr. Malloy's actions, we are willing to recognize a portion of this valley as a semi-autonomous land trust." Lydia leaned forward. "A reservation?" "No." Kane's voice cut in from the dark. "Not a reservation. A trust. Held privately by the people who live here, under your law." Sterling nodded reluctantly. "Precisely. The railroad still needs a path west, but the engineers have determined they can route the track along the southern rim. It will add 10 miles of track and cost an additional $50,000. But it avoids the Central Valley and the, burial grounds." "And the water rights?" Lydia asked sharply. "A train needs water. If you drain the creek, the corn dies." Sterling looked at her, surprised by her acumen. We will draft a clause guaranteeing minimal flow for agricultural use. Guaranteed, Lydia corrected. Not minimal, sustainable. They haggled for 3 days. Lydia used every ounce of her education, every lesson in rhetoric she had learned in the parlors of Philadelphia, and applied it to the survival of Red Moon Hollow. She argued over boundaries, over grazing rights, over the legal status of the Navajo who would live there. Finally, the preliminary agreement was drafted. It was not perfect. It was a compromise born of blood and necessity. But it was a shield. Then came the second offer. On the final evening, Commissioner Sterling found Lydia walking by the creek. "Miss Hart," he said, falling into step beside her. "There is a personal matter we must discuss." "I have no personal matters." "Commissioner," Lydia said, "my life is here." "Is it?" Sterling stopped and looked at her. "You are a young woman of breeding. Lydia, you have been through a terrible ordeal. The government feels responsible." He pulled a letter from his coat. "The Malloy estate will be liquidated to pay for damages and legal fees. A significant portion of those funds has been earmarked as a settlement for you, for the fraud, for the breach of contract, for emotional distress." Lydia looked at the envelope. "How much?" "Enough to return to Philadelphia in triumph," Sterling said softly. "Enough to buy a house on the main line. Enough to never have to smell horse manure or fear a gunshot again. You could be a wealthy woman. Lydia, you could reclaim your place in society." Lydia took the letter. It felt light in her hand, but the promise inside was heavy. "The train leaves for Santa Fe in 2 days," Sterling said. "We have a private car reserved for you. Think about it. This life," he gestured to the dust, "the rough hogans, the vast, empty desert. It is hard. It breaks people. You do not have to stay and break with it." He walked away, leaving Lydia standing by the water, the letter burning a hole in her palm. That night, the conflict that had been brewing inside Lydia boiled over. She sat in the small adobe cabin she shared with Dolores. On the bed lay her old blue dress, cleaned and mended as best as possible. Beside it lay the buckskin trousers and cotton shirts she had worn during the siege. 2 lives, 2 worlds. In one, there was tea in porcelain cups, libraries filled with books, and the safety of paved streets. In the other, there was constant wind, the threat of drought, the prejudice of the world, and a fight that would likely never truly end. She thought of the way the women in Philadelphia looked at her with pity, with judgment. She thought of the way the women in the Hollow looked at her now with respect, but still with a distance. She was the Billigana who owned the paper. She was useful, but did she belong? The door creaked open. Lydia did not turn. She knew the footfalls. "The commissioner says you are leaving," Kane said. Lydia turned. Kane stood in the doorway. He looked tired. The bandage on his shoulder was clean, but he moved with the stiffness of a man carrying too many scars. "He offered me a settlement," Lydia said. "Money, a ticket home." "It is what you wanted," Kane said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "When you stepped off that train, it was all you wanted. To be safe, to be provided for." "That was a lifetime ago," Lydia said. "I am not that woman anymore." "Are you?" Kane walked into the room. He picked up the blue dress, the fabric slipping through his rough fingers. "This is your skin, Lydia, this soft wool, this lace. You put on the leather because you had to survive the storm. But the storm is over." Lydia looked at him, searching for a sign of what he wanted. "Are you telling me to go?" Kane turned to look out the window, avoiding her gaze. "I am telling you that this land eats softness. It is cruel. You have fought well. You have earned your peace. If you go back, you will have a life of comfort. You will have a husband who does not sleep with a knife under his pillow." "And what if I do not want comfort?" Lydia stepped closer to him. "What if I want you?" Kane's jaw tightened. "I am not a prize, Lydia. I am a man with a target on his back. Even with the paper, they will hate us. If you stay with me, you will be the white whore of a savage. They will never let you forget it." He turned to her, his eyes blazing with a sudden, fierce intensity. "I love you too much to make you a prisoner of my war. I saw my sister die because she could not leave. I will not watch you wither here because you feel you owe me a debt." "A debt?" Lydia recoiled as if slapped. "You think I would stay out of obligation?" "I think you are grateful we survived," Kane said brutally. "But gratitude is not enough for a lifetime of dust." He walked past her, toward the door. "The train leaves on Friday. If you are on it, I will not stop you. I will not be in the cage." He left. Lydia stood alone in the silence. He was pushing her away. He was giving her the freedom she had come west to find. She walked out of the cabin, needing air. She climbed the narrow path that led to the high ridge overlooking the valley. The night air was cold, biting at her skin. She sat on the edge of the precipice, her legs dangling over the void. Below her, the valley was a pool of shadows. She could see the faint glow of the fires in the hogans. She took the letter from her pocket. The paper was crisp. It represented safety. It represented logic. Any sane person would take it. She looked up at the sky. It was a dome of infinite black, scattered with stars so bright they looked like shards of ice. She remembered the night on the platform. The wind howled, the terror of being abandoned, and she remembered Kane's voice, asking the question that had changed everything. "Will you hold me until the night ends?" Lydia closed her eyes. Kane had not asked for sex. He had not asked for money. He had asked for a witness. He had asked for someone to share the weight of the darkness so it would not crush him. "The night," Lydia whispered to the stars. The night Kane spoke of was not just the hours between sunset and sunrise. It was the long walk. It was the massacres. It was the systematic erasure of his people. It was a night that had lasted for 300 years. If she left, she would escape that night. She would go back to a world where the sun always shone on people like her. But Kane would still be in the dark. He would be holding the line alone. And she realized, with a clarity that hit her like a lightning strike, that she could not go back. The comfort of the East was a lie. It was built on the same ignorance that allowed men like Malloy to exist. She looked at the letter again. Then, she struck a match against the rock. She held the flame to the corner of the envelope. The paper caught fire, curling and blackening. She watched it burn until it threatened her fingers. Then she let it go. The ashes drifted down into the canyon, swallowed by the dark. "I am not a passenger," Lydia said. "I am the bridge." She stood up. Her decision was made. She would not just be Kane's wife. She would be his voice in the rooms he was not allowed to enter. She would use her white skin, her education, her civilized heritage as a weapon to protect this place. She ran down the path. She did not go to her cabin. She went to the flat roof of the adobe structure where Kane slept. She climbed the wooden ladder. Kane was there. He was lying on his back, staring at the sky, his hands folded behind his head. He looked like a statue carved from grief. He tensed as she stepped onto the roof, but he did not reach for his weapon. He knew her step. Lydia walked over to him. She did not say a word. She lay down beside him on the rough clay roof. Kane turned his head. "You should be packing." "I burned the letter," Lydia said calmly. Kane went still. "Lydia, that was a fortune." "It was blood money," she said. "And it was the price of a ticket to a place I no longer belong." "You belong in a palace," Kane said, his voice cracking slightly. "Not on a roof in the freezing cold." "I belong where the truth is," Lydia said. She reached out and took his hand. It was cold. She brought it to her lips and kissed the rough knuckles. "And the truth is here. With you." "It will be hard," Kane warned, though his fingers threaded through hers, gripping tight. "They will try to cheat us on the water. They will try to break the treaty. It will be a fight every day." "I know," Lydia said. "I am counting on it." She rolled onto her side, facing him. She placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. She could feel it beating strong, steady, vital. "You asked me to hold you until the night ends," Lydia whispered. "But the night is not over, Kane. It is just changing, and I am not going to let go until the sun rises for all of us." Kane looked at her. The stoicism, the warrior's mask, finally crumbled. Tears welled in his dark eyes. spilling over to track through the dust on his face. He reached up and touched her hair, his touch reverent, as if he could not believe she was real. "I was so afraid," he confessed, his voice a broken whisper. "I was so afraid you would leave. I would have let you go, but it would have killed the last part of me." "I am here," Lydia said. "I am yours, and you are mine." She moved closer, pressing her body against his. There was no desperate urgency this time, no frantic grasp for life in the face of death. This was a slow, deliberate coming together. They lay under the vast canopy of the Milky Way, the universe wheeling above them. Cain wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into the shelter of his body. He traced the line of her spine, the curve of her neck, memorizing her with his hands. Lydia unbuttoned the collar of his shirt and rested her cheek against his warm skin. She used her finger to draw invisible shapes on his chest circles, lines, the path of the river. "What are you drawing?" Cain murmured, the vibration of his voice humming against her ear. "A map," Lydia whispered. "A map of the future." They lay there for hours, talking in low voices about the school she would build, the letters she would write to the newspapers in Santa Fe, the way they would teach the children to read the treaties so they could never be tricked again. It was the most intimate night of their lives, not because of the physical act, though the heat between them was undeniable, but because of the terrifying vulnerability of choosing a difficult life together over an easy life apart. The next morning, the signing ceremony took place. Commissioner Sterling looked surprised to see Lydia standing next to Cain, dressed not in the blue silk, but in a clean cotton skirt and a velvet blouse. Dolores had given her the clothing of a woman of the territory. "You have made your decision, Miss Hart?" Sterling asked, holding out the pen. "It is Mrs. Nez," Lydia corrected him, her voice ringing clear across the valley. She took the pen. "Or it will be, as soon as we can find a priest brave enough to marry us." She signed the document. "Lydia Hart Nez." She handed the pen to Cain. He signed his name below hers. Cain Nez. 2 names, 2 worlds, bound together on paper and in blood. Sterling took the document. "This grants the trust, but I must warn you, the railroad is coming. Progress is a heavy wheel. It crushes those who stand in its way." "Then we will not stand in its way," Cain said, his arm around Lydia's waist. "We will build the track it runs on, but we will decide where it goes." Sterling tipped his hat and climbed into his carriage. The federal convoy rolled out of the valley, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Lydia and Cain stood at the entrance of Red Moon Hollow. The sun was high now, bleaching the red rocks to a blinding white. The preliminary battle was over. The legal war had begun. Lydia looked at the tracks of the carriage. She felt the weight of the revolver at her hip and the warmth of Cain's hand in hers. She knew there would be days of hunger, days of rage, days where the prejudice of the world would try to tear them apart. But as she looked up at Cain and saw the faint ghost of a smile touching his lips, she knew she had made the only choice that mattered. "Are you ready?" Cain asked. Lydia nodded. "The night is ending. My love, let us get to work." The falling action closed not with a fanfare, but with the quiet, resolute sound of a hammer striking a nail as the people of Red Moon Hollow began to rebuild their home. The ashes were swept away. The new foundation was being laid, and at the center of it stood a warrior and a bride, holding each other up against the weight of the world. The year 1881 came to the New Mexico territory not with the roar of cannon fire, but with the rhythmic, industrious sound of hammers striking wood. Red Moon Hollow was no longer a secret refuge on a map that did not exist. It had become something far more dangerous to the old order of the West. It had become a town. The sun beat down on the adobe walls of the new schoolhouse, a sturdy, rectangular structure built by the hands of Navajo warriors and Mexican stonemasons working side by side. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of chalk dust and dried cedar. Lydia Hart Nez stood at the front of the room. She wore a skirt of simple gray cotton, durable and practical, hemmed with a strip of red velvet in the Navajo style. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, secured not with a tortoiseshell comb from Philadelphia, but with a silver pin hammered by a local silversmith. "Repeat after me," Lydia said, her voice clear and authoritative. She pointed to the words written on the slate board. "The river flows to the sea," a dozen voices chorused back. "The river flows to the sea." The students were a mixture that would have caused a scandal in Boston. There were Navajo children with their hair tied back in traditional buns, Mexican children from the families who worked the nearby sheep runs, and even two freckle-faced boys from a white family that had settled near the creek to manage the new irrigation pumps. "Very good," Lydia said. She erased the board. "Now, who can tell me how to say river in the language of the Dine?" A small hand shot up. It belonged to Little Bear, a boy who had lost his father in the siege a year ago. "Two," the boy said proudly. "Excellent." Lydia smiled. She wrote the word phonetically on the board next to the English one. "We must remember both. One allows us to trade with the world. The other tells us who we are." This was her rebellion. It was quiet. It was academic. And it was fierce. Every word of Navajo she recorded in her heavy leather ledger. Every legend she translated into English for the archives was a victory against the erasure the government had planned. Outside, the sound of galloping hooves drew her attention to the window. Cain Nez was riding across the valley floor. He was no longer the lone scout hiding in the shadows. He rode a tall bay stallion, leading a group of teenage boys, Navajo and white alike, on a training exercise. He signaled with his hand, and the boys wheeled their horses in a precise formation. They were not learning to fight the cavalry. They were learning to herd the growing flock of sheep that now sustained the valley's economy. They were learning to track lost cattle in the slot canyons. They were learning to be guardians. Cain looked toward the schoolhouse. Even from this distance, Lydia felt the connection, a pull as tangible as a rope. He touched the brim of his hat, a silent greeting. Before turning his horse back toward the canyon rim, the train whistle blew in the distance. It was not the shrill, terrifying shriek that had haunted Lydia's dreams after her arrival at Dusty Mesa. It was a lower, friendlier tone, signaling an approach, not an invasion. Lydia dismissed the class for the midday break. The children spilled out into the sunlight, their laughter echoing off the red cliffs that had once rung with rifle fire. Lydia walked down the path toward the center of the settlement. The transformation was miraculous. Where there had once been only temporary hogans, there was now a bustling plaza. Dolores had expanded her kitchen into a full, open-air market. The smell of roasted green chilies and frying bread filled the air. "Mrs. Hartnez," Dolores called out, waving a wooden spoon. "The delegation is here. They look thirsty and very confused." Lydia smoothed her skirt and walked toward the small structure that bore the freshly painted sign, Red Moon Station. It was the smallest stop on the Santa Fe line. The train did not scream through the valley. It slowed to a respectful crawl, curving along the southern rim just as the treaty had stipulated, avoiding the sacred burial grounds entirely. It stopped only long enough to drop off mail, pick up wool shipments, and occasionally deposit curious visitors. Today, the visitors were a group of journalists and minor officials from the East Coast. Sent to inspect the Red Moon experiment, they stood on the platform, looking uncomfortable in their heavy wool suits, swatting at flies and eyeing the Navajo men who were loading bales of wool onto the freight car. Lydia stepped onto the platform. "Welcome to Red Moon Hollow, gentlemen." The lead journalist, a man named Mr. Pembroke with ink-stained fingers and a skeptical expression, turned to her. He blinked, taking in her appearance. He had clearly expected a downtrodden victim or a woman gone savage. Instead, he saw a woman who radiated a calm, terrifying competence. "You are the Heart Woman?" Pembroke asked. "The one who was abandoned?" "I am Lydia Hartnez," she corrected him, extending a hand that was calloused from work but steady. "And I was not abandoned. Mr. Pembroke, I was redirected to my destiny. Would you like some water? The desert air is unforgiving to those who talk too much." She led them on a tour. She showed them the irrigation ditches that Cain had designed, using ancient Pueblo techniques to water the corn. She showed them the schoolhouse where the children were learning geometry. She showed them the legal office, a small desk in the back of the trading post, where she helped the local families file land claims and read contracts so that men like Malloy could never swindle them again. "But surely," Pembroke pressed as they walked along the tracks, "you miss civilization, the opera, the fashion. Do you not feel isolated?" Lydia stopped. She looked at the tracks stretching out toward the horizon. "Civilization, Mr. Pembroke, is not velvet curtains and gas lamps." Lydia said, "Civilization is how you treat the stranger at your gate. It is how you protect the weak. By that definition, I have found more civilization in this canyon than I ever found in the ballrooms of Philadelphia." She pointed to the train. "That machine used to be a weapon. It was going to cut this valley in half. Now, it brings Dr. Ward his medicine bottles. It takes our wool to market. We did not stop the future, sir. We simply bent it until it fit the shape of our humanity." The journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks. They had come for a tragedy. They were leaving with a philosophy. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and burnt orange, the visitors boarded the evening train. The locomotive huffed, spewing a cloud of gray smoke, and began to chug slowly out of the valley. Lydia remained on the platform. It was a small wooden structure, much like the one at Dusty Mesa where she had stood a year ago, penniless and terrified. But this platform was not a place of abandonment. It was a threshold. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and cooling earth. The air turned crisp, the desert dropping its temperature with its usual suddenness. Lydia wrapped her arms around herself, watching the red taillights of the train fade into the distance. She heard the footsteps behind her, heavy, deliberate, silent to anyone who did not know how to listen. Kane stepped up behind her. He did not speak immediately. He simply moved close enough that his chest brushed against her back. He wrapped his strong arms around her waist, pulling her back against him. His chin came to rest on her shoulder, his cheek pressing against hers. He smelled of horse, of leather, and of the wind. He was warm, a solid anchor in the shifting sea of twilight. "They asked many questions," Kane murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "They did," Lydia replied, leaning into his embrace, letting her head fall back against his shoulder. "They wanted to know if I was happy." "And what did you tell them?" "I told them happiness is a small word," Lydia said. "I told them I am useful. I told them I am home." Kane tightened his hold on her. He looked out at the valley. In the fading light, the children were running home for supper. Navajo, Mexican, and white children, their silhouettes indistinguishable in the dusk, chasing each other through the sagebrush. "1 year ago," Kane said softly, "I stood in the shadows and watched a woman in a blue dress try not to cry. I thought she was a bird with a broken wing." "And now?" Lydia asked, turning her head slightly to see his profile. "Now?" Kane smiled, a rare, genuine expression that softened the hard angles of his face. "I think she is the hawk that rules the canyon." He turned her around in his arms so they were facing each other. The beadwork on his leather vest scratched gently against the fabric of her dress. His eyes, once so full of guarded pain and ancient anger, were clear. "The night is coming," Kane said, looking up at the first stars appearing in the indigo sky. "It is," Lydia agreed. Kane looked down at her. His expression turned serious, playful yet profound. "If a day comes when the darkness returns, Lydia, if the night is long again, will you still hold me until it ends?" Lydia looked at him. She thought of the battles they had fought, the gun smoke, the courtroom arguments, the nights spent debating the future of the school, the nights spent in the quiet, desperate intimacy of lovers who know the world is fragile. She reached up and cupped his face in her hands. "My love," she whispered, "I will hold you until the stars burn out and the sun forgets to rise. But look around you." She gestured to the valley, to the lights flickering on in the hogans, to the safe, quiet track of the railroad. to the peace that lay over the land like a blanket. "The night is not a monster anymore," she said. "It is just the time we'd rest before we build again." She rose on her tiptoes and kissed him. It was not the tentative kiss of two strangers in a storm. It was not the desperate kiss of two people about to die. It was the kiss of a husband and wife. It was deep, confident, and possessed a wild, enduring heat that belonged to the land itself. It tasted of promise. Cain kissed her back, lifting her slightly off the wooden planks, burying his face in the curve of her neck. They stood there as the last light faded. The wind blew Lydia's hair across her face, and the silver and turquoise bracelet on her wrist, a gift from grandmother Nyan, caught the last ray of the sun, sparkling like a captured star. The train was gone. The journalists were gone with their questions and their skepticism. What remained was the truth. The railroad track was no longer a scar cutting through the heart of the Navajo land. It was a lifeline, a two-way street that brought medicine and books, but took away the isolation that bred fear. The valley was no longer a hideout for the desperate. It was a cradle for a new kind of life, a life where a Navajo warrior could be a teacher, and a Philadelphia bride could be a guardian of the desert. Lydia thought back to the girl she had been, the girl who wanted a safe marriage, a brick house, and a guarantee. She had found none of those things. Instead, she had found a love that was dangerous and demanding. She had found a family not of blood, but of shared battle. And she had found a night that she no longer feared, because she was the fire that lit it. Cain took her hand, his fingers interlaced with hers, rough skin against smooth, red earth against white snow, holding tight. "Let us go home," Cain said. "Yes," Lydia replied. "Let us go home." They walked hand in hand off the platform, stepping onto the red earth of their valley. Above them, the vast western sky opened up, endless and free. The night had come, but it was not dark. It was illuminated by the fires of the hearths they had protected, and by the dawn that was already waiting, inevitable and bright, just beneath the horizon. Thank you so much for listening to the story, Will You Hold Me Until the Night Ends? It has been a long journey from the dusty platform of Mesa Station to the peaceful twilight of Red Moon Hollow. I am truly grateful you walked this path with Lydia and Cain. I would love to hear your thoughts on their journey. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from and what you thought of the ending. Did Lydia make the right choice? If you enjoyed this tale of the Wild West, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Hit that like button and give the video a hype so that more people can discover this story. Your support helps me keep the campfire burning and the stories coming. Until the next ride, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon.